Today is May 26, 2006, and Mallory Hines with Debbie Reinbold and Karen Judd. We're interviewing Mr. John Nebbeling at his little home on Murray U Street. And he was born on January 2nd, 1920, and he served in the United States Army during World War II in Italy, France, Germany, Austria, and Bavaria. So, Mr. Nebbeling, what was your family and your life like before the war?
During the Depression, my dad had lost his business. He was in partnership with two other artists, commercial artists that I know of, and in the Grand Rapids Bank building downtown. And when the Depression hit, their money was tied up in the bank. They were out of business. And my dad was, at that point, trying to buy 3 different houses. We lived on Rumsey Street and off of Granville Avenue, and he had bought a house on Oakland and also in Smith Court. He owned a house near the American Laundry on Division Avenue in Grand Rapids. So when the war broke out, oh my goodness sakes, that has nothing to do with the war. That was way before the war and the Depression. He lost everything that he had, and we boys essentially went out, sold newspapers, and made money wherever we could, did jobs, odd jobs. And my mother got a job working at the American Laundry, so everybody was working except my father. And they gave him some jobs from the WPA, Work Projects Administration, during the Depression, before World War II. So we all were in the family with 5 children, and we were all in parochial school. And the administrators of the parochial school asked us to go to public school because they couldn't afford to carry us, and we couldn't afford to pay the tuition. So we went to public school, and in later years, I went to the CCCs when I wasn't supposed to go. My brother had a notice that he could join, and I picked up that notice and went down and signed up, went into the CCCs. And eventually got my diploma, my high school diploma in the CCCs. And then the war broke out. Well, before the war broke out, I was a tile setter. I got a job setting tile for a Consolidated Tile Company in Grand Rapids. And when they activated the 32nd Division, I was a member of the National Guard. And I had a buddy, Julius Palazzolo, that had joined also, because if you joined the National Guard, you got paid, I think it was monthly. You made a few dollars. And so our neighbor was John Shirley, who was a sergeant in the National Guard. And I think everyone in Grand Rapids knew at that time John Shirley. He was quite a famous soldier. And during the war, he was killed in Buna, so Buna. They let Julius and I out when they activated the 32nd Division out of Grand Rapids and sent them over to Wisconsin. And then when the war broke out in 1942, we were called up. I was called up, and Julius Palazzolo joined the Navy. Before he got called up, they placed me in the infantry, And
What kind of training did you have after you joined the Army?
well, when we first went into the Army, they sent us to Camp Robinson, Arkansas. And there was a cadre there of Japanese boys that had been in the Army and were thoroughly capable of training infantry troops. And at that time, they had placed their parents, those Japanese boys' parents, into a camp in Arizona, I believe, or maybe it was still in California, to get them away from the coast. Why they didn't trust those Japanese people, I don't understand, because their sons were in the American Army, and yet the Japanese people would put in camps to keep them away from the coast because of Japan bombing Pearl Harbor. Anyhow, those boys, those Japanese boys, trained us to train troops. And we became what they call cadre, to train infantry troops.
What types of things did you do at Camp Robinson besides what?
Well, the first thing we had to do was they had 13 weeks of training, I think, for us, and we had to become experts in every weapon. And there was a book called 21-100, I believe it was called. It was an infantry training manual, and we had to learn that verbatim, virtually speaking, in order to train troops. And I think I remember memorizing that book from cover to cover. And I trained troops for 2 years. And at the end of 2 years, I asked to be transferred to combat because I was tired of sending young boys to combat. And they transferred me to North Camp Hood, Texas. And I found out that we were to retrain a bunch of young college graduates, the boys that had 2 years of college and had been slated to go to Army Specialized Training for officers. And they had decided, because of the losses that they were incurring in Africa, in the African campaign, that they would replace those losses that they were incurring with these boys that were not needed for officers at that particular time. And I resented the fact that they were going to take those young fellows and send them to the infantry. So I refused to train them. And the only way they could transfer me at North Camp Hood, Texas, was to transfer me out of the infantry and into the artillery. And the colonel was a Mexican young fellow, nice Mexican colonel, asked me how he could help me. Would it be all right if he transferred me to the artillery? And I said, yes, I don't care as long as I go to combat. So he arranged for a transfer to the artillery, and they shipped me to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. And after helping to retrain a group that had been brought back from the Pacific Islands, a bunch of boys, there was 200 of them, that had spent 2 years on a Pacific island, lounging in the sun, enjoying everything, and forgetting the fact that they were in the Army, actually. These boys had to be retrained for combat, and it was a mess. So I ended up helping to teach them to march, shoot, fight, and everything else. And then they transferred me finally to the 405th Field Artillery Group headquarters, which was going overseas to combat. And they had transferred me in there to run the help with the wire section, to take over the wire section, actually. That was the telephones and coding and decoding of radio and so forth. Well, after I got into this outfit, the fellow that was the head of the wire division didn't want to be transferred out. He was a tech sergeant, and I was just a corporal. I was scheduled to be moved up to a sergeant, but this boy asked his captain, who happened to be an ex-school teacher out of Minnesota, that asked him to leave him in the wire section, which the captain allowed. So they didn't know what to do with me. And I stayed in the wire section until we were in Italy. I was transferred from the wire section and transferred to a machine gun, a 50 caliber machine gun. I became a machine gunner. But am I getting ahead of the story? I don't know.
No, you're doing fine. How did you keep in touch with your family when you were overseas?
How did I what?
Keep in touch with your family when you were overseas.
Well, when I first went into service, they gave me a leave after 6 months. 6 months or 7 or 8 months, I don't know how long I'd been in, but they gave me a leave to go home. I went home on a 3-day pass and saw my family and went back to camp. That was when I was in Camp Robinson, Arkansas. And then just before I went over Camp Campbell, Kentucky, I asked for another leave. And they couldn't allow it because they were getting ready to send me overseas. And my wife today was my girlfriend then, my fiancée. She and my mother came down and visited me at Camp Campbell, Kentucky for 3 days. Now there's a little chipmunk. I don't know how that thing gets in here. But they came down and saw me for 3 days, and then we were activated and sent overseas. Before that happened, though, when I was shipped into Camp Campbell, Kentucky to join this outfit, we were dropped off at a train stop out in the country. And there was just a new rookie soldier and myself. Dropped off in the wilderness, and I didn't know where we were and what was happening. And a Jeep drove up, and it was the captain's driver and a Jeep. He picked us up, and on the way into camp, he told me that the outfit was not a very happy camp. That the captain ate dinner with the first three sergeants, the top sergeants in the outfit. And he got a report on all of the soldiers from the top 3 sergeants, and that it wasn't really a good way. It wasn't the way that I was used to seeing the troops handled in the service. Generally speaking, sergeants and the enlisted men all ate together and worked together, and the officers all ate together and worked together, and we all did our own jobs, and there was no discussing of each person's qualifications, or there was no clique setup. But this was a very unusual setup for me. I couldn't understand was happening, and this driver told me that they didn't like the way the captain and the non-coms got together and talked about him. So I didn't like the setup that I was hearing about. And when I got into camp, I went up to take a shower. We were placed in a barracks, on the second floor of a barracks. And on the top floor, we had the last two bunks in the barracks, this rookie and I. So I heard a commotion, and I went down to take a shower. And I looked outside, and there was a guy pulling up the mailbox. The post was in the ground, and he just loosened it all up, pulled it up out of the ground, threw it down. Then he went into the barracks, and he was throwing all the bedding out of the windows, and all the guys were standing around outside cheering him, sort of. I thought, what the heck is going on? So I took a shower and went up, got dressed, and this guy kept going through the barracks, throwing all of the bedding out of the windows. And he got up to the young man's bunk next to me, and I told him, I said, keep your hands off that bunk. He said, what? I said, I gave you an order. Keep your hands off that bunk. He reached down and grabbed that bunk, and I hit him with a foot locker and put him in the hospital. I went and called him in outside and told him, take this guy to the hospital, get a litter, take him to the hospital, because I think I killed him. So they did. They took him to the hospital, and then the captain wanted to see me. So I went in and reported to the captain, saluted. His desk was only about 2 or 3 feet from the doorway. So I stepped into his office, and he called me to attention. No, I came to attention and saluted him and reported as ordered. And he said, at ease. What's this I hear about you putting someone in the hospital? So I explained to him what happened. And he said, come to attention. I'm not going to put up with this kind of behavior. And I thought to myself, well, what is he putting up with? I mean, here's an officer that's supposed to have these men all trained, and they're supposed to behave themselves, and it's all right for a drunk to tear up a barracks. I couldn't understand it. But I just saluted and said, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir. Finally, when he was all done, he dismissed me. I was standing in the middle of the doorway. He hollered at me to stand back 2 paces from his desk when he first called me to attention. And I was standing in the middle of the doorway. I saluted him, left. I didn't hear anything from him again until we were ready to ship out. And they had a great big party. I didn't know anybody or see anybody around that I knew, so I just enjoyed the party. On the last day, it happened again. There were some guys in PX drinking beer. I don't know how they could get drunk on that stuff. I don't know. I think that beer was a 3.2. It was only a very small percentage of alcohol, but this one Mexican boy, he must have got pretty drunk. He stepped out in the middle of the road and he was challenging everybody to fight. Nobody would go up and shut him up. He was using bad language. So I just went over and hit him, knocked him down. And that put a stop to that. I didn't hear anything about that, hitting that soldier. But after that, they all started to behave when they were around me pretty well. I didn't have any trouble again until we were in Italy.
What was life like in Italy?
What was it like in Italy?
Yeah.
Well, the funny thing was we were on a boat for a couple of weeks, it seemed like, going over. We went over from Newport News, West Virginia, or Virginia, whatever it is. And when we, on the road, on the highway, on the sea, I mean, on the highway, on the sea, we had one alert. And I remember standing at the rail watching these destroyers just take a turn, a left turn, and just almost lay over on their side and just go. They were dropping some depth charges because there was supposed to be German submarines around there. And we got through that mess, nothing happened. But the Catholic, they had two chaplains. There was a Catholic chaplain and a Protestant chaplain. I'm a Lutheran, and we had a Lutheran chaplain. And this Catholic chaplain, he came up to me on board. We were watching this scene going on out there. And he said, John, he said, how do you feel about going into combat? And I said, sir, I volunteered because I was sick of training troops. So I don't have any feeling about it at all. But whatever God wants is going to happen. He agreed with me, and that must have been what he wanted to hear, because from then on, all through the war, he was always my friend and trying to side up and do something for me. I mean, he was a good chaplain. But one of the things he was an alcoholic. And I found out overseas when we were in combat that all I had to do was ask him for a bottle, and he'd give me a bottle because he didn't want it. And Colonel was a little upset because I always had liquor, and I didn't realize it, but by the time I got home, I thought I was an alcoholic. And I was so afraid of booze that I wouldn't touch it for weeks and for months. I just stayed away from it. Then I found out I could live without it, so I thank God for that. Where'd I leave off now?
What would...
I was like 6 years
what about the supplies? What did you do for supplies when you were overseas?
Well, that was before the bulge. You know what happened at the bulge? You ever hear that story about, there's a lot of talk about the bulge. Well, we were driven back. But before that time, there was times when the captain would need some supplies, like wire was always being brought in, because they would leave the wire laying when they would move forward. And every time they'd stop, they'd lay about 10 or 12 miles of wire. And so the captain ordered me to take a 3/4 ton truck and the driver. And we went back and got a load of wire one time. And on the way back, it was got to be nightfall, and so we were driving with our what they call night lights. They were little teeny bulbs, but no headlights. And we were on the highway going on, I'd say 30 miles an hour maybe. We ran into a wreck that was on the road. And fortunately, nobody got hurt. But that was one occasion where we lost a vehicle. And they used me for, the captain used me for getting supplies, everything except what I don't know. Anything that they needed done, they'd call on me to seem to do. So after the bulge, we got driven back 40 miles, and when the day before the Germans attacked us, we were on the south flank of the Third Army, and our observers had spotted the Germans on the road. There was thousands of them, and we knew something was going to happen. So the colonel ordered, I was in the office for some reason, and the headquarters where they had the radios, and the colonel ordered them to stay away from the flyboys that were observing this, observers. Stay away from the Germans as far as possible and still see what was going on. And we got all the coordinates set. We had maps. And we knew exactly where they were. And we watched, and he said, well, there was a battalion. There must be at least 2,000 troops out there. And he said, no, it's a regiment. There must be 5,000 or 6,000 troops out there. And he said, oh no, he said, there's 2 or 3 regiments. It's unbelievable. He said, how many Germans are coming down the road? And this was coming down towards our sector. And the Third Army was on our north, to our north. And we watched until they fired one round to get the distance for the artillery, and they got all of the artillery on the 7th Army front that could reach that area of road. There might have been, well, 6 battalions, 6 of artillery. I don't know how many, 400 companies. But there was probably around 50 or 80 guns that could reach that target. And they all were trained on that road. And when the Germans got under that road, and we could tell it from the airplane gave us the notice that they were all on that road. They opened up with everything they had on the 7th Army front. And they killed an awful lot of Germans. But still, the next day, those Germans made an attack and drove us back 40 miles. Day and night for about 3 days, we went backwards. They drove us backwards about 40 miles, and we ended up in a town called Buxweiler. And the Third Army was driven back. They must have been driven back 70 miles because they were always ahead. There was a point, and that was why the Germans had attacked. The Third Army always tried to get, they had the tanks, and they were always way in the lead in a V shape going into Germany. Well, we hadn't even reached Germany yet, and they drove us back about 40 miles. And we finally stopped the Germans. And after we were there at least 3 days, maybe a week. And it was one morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, it was raining. And I was outside waiting to get the order to move up. I was still on a machine gun. And I was just standing around there waiting, and the guy that was supposed to drive the car behind the tanks was a sergeant. He had a nervous breakdown, started crying like a baby and fell all apart, and they took him back to the hospital. I was just standing there, and the colonel said, "Nebbeling, can you drive that car?" I said, "I don't have a driver's license, sir." "I didn't ask you if you had a driver's license." He said, "Get in that car. Can you drive that car?" "Yes, sir." "Drive it." I ended up then driving that car behind the tanks, and it was a position called intelligence sergeant. I was made sergeant, and my job to the end of the war then was to drive behind the tanks. And I would drive for 3 days, 3 days and 2 nights. And they gave me a bottle of Benny pills to keep awake, so that I couldn't sleep. You know, I'd just take those Benny pills so I wouldn't fall asleep. And we drove a car that had a radio in it that would reach 6 or 10 miles. It was called a 610 radio. And when the tanks got stopped, we would call for artillery fire in order to clean out the Germans up ahead. Then the tanks would move ahead. We lost quite a few tanks, and we lost a couple of cars that I drove in. As soon as the firing, the tanks would go by and the machine guns would open up. When that would happen, I would be out of that car and into the ditch with a rifle. So that I went through the war and didn't get wounded by rifle fire or anything, but I did get cut with a bayonet one night, killed a quail giant. We were following these tanks, and we got into the forest just before we got into Germany. And for some reason, we run into the Germans and we were surrounded. So the colonel ordered us not to go across the road and to stay in the company with the area there that we were pinned down in. And I thought, oh no, we're going to get artillery. Tonight we're going to get bombed. The Germans had a habit of coming around with a bed check, Charlie. They would check you just before dark, and then they would bomb after dark. And by doing that, the ACAC couldn't knock them down, evidently. Had a hard time shooting them down. So I figured we were going to get bombed that night. And I went across the road and I dug a slit trench to sleep in. And I went to sleep. And about midnight, there was a full moon. And I had my hole all camouflaged and everything, but a German soldier stepped in there with a bayonet, fell on me. He fell in the hole, and I had a pistol in each hand, and I fired a pistol at him. And his bayonet hit me in the shoulder, cut me. And he went flying out of the hole one way, and I went out the other way. Went across, got back away from him. Medic came over and put a bandage on me. And I don't know, I had a little fever, I guess, because I took my clothes off. I had my shirt off and everything, and I got into a sleeping bag, which was very tight. And I went to sleep, and I woke up about an hour later, and there was airplanes flying over. And they dive bombed. It was the Germans. They dive bombed the area. They wounded some of our people, including one chaplain. I remember he got wounded. Quite a few guys got little scratches on them. But Those were the days.
Now, when you were in Germany, you said something about an interpreter that you're really good friends with?
Yeah, we got well into Germany. We followed the Danube sort of down, and we got to Dachau just before the end of the war. That was north of Munich. We got into Dachau. We were following the tanks as usual, and we saw all of these Jews on the road. Now these boys were just in what they call prison garb, and they were on the roads, starving to death, and they were all skeletons. They were sick. And we went by them, and we went into this town. Now I can't remember the name of that town. Well, it was Dachau. Anyhow, as we were going past this prison, the general that was in charge of the artillery told our colonel to take care of those boys, those Jewish boys that were on the road, and get them medical care, get them fed. We threw our rations and everything to them as we went by them too. But we stopped and we went in Dachau, right outside of the camp, there was a school, two-story school in Dachau. And they took over the upper floor of it, I remember, and they were putting bunks up there. And the colonel ordered me to get the mayor of the town and get the people organized to take care of these Jewish boys. So I got a hold of I found out where the mayor was. I went to his house, and they let me in, and I told him that the colonel wanted him. I speak enough German to get by, and he evidently understood some English too, because I told him that the colonel had said that they wanted him to help set up and take care of these prisoners, help set up the school building. Well, he said, he wasn't going to go out, not get shot because it was dark, and he couldn't go out of the house. I put a 45 to his head and told him, well, he could go out or I'd kill him. And he decided to go. So I took him over to the schoolhouse and introduced him to the colonel. The colonel told me to go down to the hospital and empty that hospital of the German soldiers. There was a little German hospital there next to Dachau, or right on the edge of Dachau. So I went down there and ordered all of the troops that could walk, even with crutches, to line up outside. We put them on trucks, took them out of there, and then we put the Jewish boys that needed hospitalization in there so they could be taken care of. This all happened in a period of about one day. And by the end of 12 hours or so, we had that all organized. The tanks started moving, so we moved along behind them. But we did pick up one little boy that was an interpreter. He spoke 5 languages. He was a Jewish boy that came out of Belgium. I never got his name and his address and all that. He worked with me for about 6 months. And he was a very intelligent, nice guy. I never got his name and his address and followed up with him. he was hoping to come to the United States. But he and his parents had been taken prisoner by the Germans. They had owned a jewelry store. He was trying to take jewels, a bag full of jewels, into Spain. When they caught him, they put him in Dachau. That's where we found him. He was a lot of help to us. After the war, he and I went out to pick up some jewelry that was left with a German family. They wanted to see to it that the Jewish family got it back. So we got the information and the jewelry, and we were taking it back to camp. We we're going driving down the road in a Jeep, and off into the field there was a travel trailer, small travel trailer. And so I drove off the road and went back there, and there was a German officer there. And it turned out to be the head of the German Air Force that was hiding out back there. And I took him, I told him that he was going to be under arrest. I had to take him in. He said he should surrender only to a colonel or better under the Articles of War. And I said, that's fine, just get your clothes on. I said, because you're going in the prison camp. And he got all dressed up in his uniform. And we took him into the colonel, introduced him to Colonel Eubank. And Colonel Eubank let him go on his own recognizance for 3 days in order to get his personal business taken care of. And I was home 6 months later before they caught him again. He lied to the colonel, and the colonel bought every word of it, evidently. So, but he was just a typical German Nazi.
When did you come home? From Europe? When did they send you home?
When I got home, well, first of all, on the way home, I used to like to gamble, and that's a stupid habit. But I learned that with blackjack, the only way you could win gambling is to double up in blackjack until you hit. So I would bet $1, and then if that didn't hit, I'd bet $2. And if that didn't hit, I'd bet $4. And then if that hit, if I made the $4, I earned $1. I just made $1. And I would do that. I'd take $1 at a time, start all over, bet $1, until I hit again. Sometimes I'd hit right away, and sometimes it would take, I'd go up to $16 and $32 before I'd hit. I'd make another $1. I had hundreds and hundreds of dollars. And I went and somehow gambled in France on the way home and lost it all. Smart. I got on that boat. I couldn't buy a Coke. Well, of course, everything was free going home, so I ate good. I got home, and when they discharged us at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, they gave us our pay that was due for the month or whatever it was, whatever they owed us, our severance pay. And so they discharged me at midnight. Well, I couldn't wait to get out of there. I got on a train and I went from Camp McCoy, Wisconsin to Milwaukee to get on a boat. And it was about 4 o'clock in the morning. So I went into a hotel and I asked them if I could buy a drink. And the guy behind the desk said, "No, you can't buy a drink, but I can give you one." So he went out back and opened up the bar and gave me a Manhattan. I wasn't satisfied with one, so he gave me two. And I got on that boat at 4 o'clock in the morning. And I'll tell you, or 5 o'clock, I don't know what time it was, by the time I got on that boat. But I stood out there in the cold wind, and I thought to myself, boy, I'm an alcoholic. I'm going home and I'm a drunk. So something's got to give. So when I got home, I wouldn't touch a drink. I wouldn't touch even beer for weeks. I was afraid that I was an alcoholic. Then I found out that I wasn't. Being very thankful. Then on, was very, very careful when I touched liquor. That's no way to live. But
How else was your life different after the war?
how was it?
After the war, your life when you got home?
Well, the first thing that I went to check on my old job, and they would have hired me back as a journeyman tile setter. But for some reason, something in the back of my mind said that I wouldn't be happy being a tile setter for the rest of my life. For some reason, I don't know why. I was very restless, and I think that's my personal makeup. So anyhow, I decided that I'd look around a little bit. My wife was a beautician. She had a good business up in Ludington. In the front of her mother's house, was her beauty shop. So she could make some money. And I decided to look around. I was offered an opportunity to go into the shoe business. A friend of ours up there, Ralph Hiller in Ludington, had a shoe business, and he was wanting to expand it. He said I could sell shoes. He'd teach me, train me, and then open up a store in north of Ludington. What is that town? Pardon?
Is it Cyber City?
No, south of there. I can't think. But anyhow, they offered. I thought about it, and I thought, no, I don't want to sell shoes. So then I was looking around in Grand Rapids, and I thought, I'll sell beauty supplies. My wife's in the beauty business. I'll learn that business. So I talked to one of the suppliers on Division Avenue downtown, and they said, they'd hire me. But they weren't ready right then to hire me. It would be about a month. And I was able to collect unemployment comp or something. When you get out of the service, they allow you 16 weeks or something of unemployment comp. So anyhow, I was collecting a little of that, and I waited. And when it was time that they should have hired me, I went back in there, and no, they weren't ready yet. So I said, well, you're just lying to me. You're not being truthful with me. I said, I'll get a job. I don't need you. So I went to their competition, which was a 'cause oh, what was the name of that? I went to their competition, another beauty supply company. And the fellow behind the counter, I went in and filled out an application. The fellow behind the counter was watching me and talking to me. And he was the owner. And he said, have you ever sold anything in your life, John? I said, yes, I sold newspapers. I said, I never had any problems with any job that I ever did. And I said, I'm sure I could sell. He said, well, let's find out. He said, I've got a new product which is called Gym Shine Floor Cleaner. Let me show you. He took a little dish with a little water in it. He put about an ounce of this floor cleaner in that dish, took a sponge, put it on the floor, and cleaned the spot. And that floor was just as clean as the top of that table. I mean, it was clean. I never saw any soap that would work like that. So I said, well, that shouldn't be a problem. He said, well, I want you to go to businesses, from store to store, and sell it to the store owners so that they can clean their floors with it. He said, start out that way. He said, don't go door to door. You pay. So I started out in Ludington. The first 3.5 days, I made over $100. And back then, people were earning about, I think they were probably earning around $30 a week. And I made $100 in 3 days. So I thought, boy, I got it made in the shade. You know? And so I went out and I sold that. I went all the way, but he wouldn't let me go in the big cities. I couldn't go in Muskegon. But I could go into Manistee. That was the town I was trying to think of before, where I wanted me to open a shoe store. But I went into Ludington and Manistee, and all up and down, up 100 miles, 150 miles north of Traverse City. All the way down 131 through Cadillac. And I made about $200-300 a week. So when I got done, I had hit every business. And the boss said, well, John, start all over again. Start where you started. Just keep going back and go over it. Well, I did. And I couldn't make enough to make it go. I mean, I could make maybe $30, $40, $50 a week, but I had expenses with the car and everything. I said, no, I'm not going to do this. So I went in to quit. And when I went in and told them, well, I tried and I quit. They said, no, John, we're going to give you a route, a beauty supply route. Try out on the beauty supply route. So I thanked him. They gave me the worst route that they had. There was 2 routes. Each week you had a different route. And so I remember the first route was over towards Holland, on Benton Harbor, south of Benton Harbor, all the way to the border virtually. And over to 131 and then north. So, but nothing, I couldn't go into Kalamazoo. Benton Harbor, well, I was in Benton Harbor. But it was too difficult. And I went through there, and as I got acquainted with the girls that run the beauty shops, they would save their orders for me. Come to find out, all the men that were selling beauty supplies during the war were older men. They weren't drafted because they were older. And I was the only young man selling beauty supplies at that time. I was only 26 years old, and evidently pretty good looking. So they would save the orders for me, and I got the whole route built up, and same thing with the other route. Both routes were paying off very well. And I went in, and one weekend the boss said, "John, we're going to have to take you off of that now, and we're going to put you on a different route, a route going over to St. John, going north." And then they gave me two different routes. And I said, "Well, I just got this route built up." I said, "It's paying good." I said, "I can't do that with a new route." I said, "I won't make as much money." So I said, "It's not fair." He said, "I'll decide what's fair." He said, "I'll give you a raise." And so, and he raised my commission also. I got salary and commission. So the more I sold, the more I made. So I went around on the second couple of routes, and I discovered that the girls had old equipment, and they needed new chairs, and they needed new tables. I started selling equipment. I doubled what the other guy had sold, and I about doubled my salary. I was making more money than any of the guys in the outfit. And one time they had a sales meeting, and at the sales meeting they would give out your bonus pay. After you hit a quota, if you hit 2,300, you got 10% on everything that was sold over that amount for the week. And every week I was getting bigger and bigger bonus checks. Well, these old guys, they were all resentful. So they all wanted raises. And anyhow, there was a lot of unhappiness. And I just quit that. I decided to quit. My brother and I wanted to build boats. Pardon?
Your wife.
So, after the war, were you in contact with any other veterans?
Yes, I joined two veteran organizations, and went to one meeting at each. One was the Veterans of Foreign Wars, the other was the American Legion. And I went to one meeting each. And at that time, those boys would sit around, they'd have a beer or two and talk. And kind of reminded me of the Army. I mean, sitting around the PX. I thought, no, this is not for me. I want no part of it. So I never went to another meeting. But I was active with Boy Scouts and with the church. And then later on, when I worked in the factory, I got active in the union. So I stayed active with different organizations and groups, but more from a religious viewpoint, you might say. I didn't want anything to do with armies per se and the government for some reason. Just part of my makeup.
How has your experience with the Army and your service affected your life in general?
There again, see, I thought, I don't think that it was a negative effect. I think that my ability to express myself and talk to other people partially came from the time when I had to train troops and be active with them. So, I think war is the biggest mistake that mankind ever made. Why would they want to kill off a fellow man in order to attain some kind of power, money, or it's just it's not understandable. You'd think that they would only want to work and provide for each other and for their families. You know, I mean, you'd think that you would want to progress, not regress. And war is regression. It's no good. Never will be, never was. That's my attitude. So I thank you for giving me the time, but I'm going to take care of my wife. She's giving me this problem, so.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much.
The following oral military history project is a series of documentaries in association with the Lowell area men and women who proudly served and sacrificed part of their lives to preserve the opportunities for all of us to build our businesses and raise our families under a blanket of freedom. For reservations and more information, contact the Lowell Area Historical Museum at 616-897-7688.